Open 2020. My name is Bunny. I'll be your chair for this round. I will have to stay on audio because my connection is not the best. The same can go for anyone here who does not have great connection. Otherwise, I need you guys to stay on video. If that's not possible, then you can stay on audio. So what we're going to do now is have everyone introduce themselves, and that way I could also check if your mic is working. I'll start with proposition. Can you just go by speaking position and speaking order, and then introduce yourself as well?
Hi, PM speaking here. I'm Jerome.
Hi, Jonathan, DPM.
Evan, Gov.
I'm sorry, I'm just going to really quickly use the toilet.
Okay. Thank you. Opposition. Oh, sorry, opposition. LO, you might need to either come closer to your mic or find a way to get a clearer audio, because I think you're not as clear as I think the others are. Can you try that again? Yeah, that's better. Yeah. Okay, second speaker.
Devansh, I'm the DLO.
Got it, thank you. And OpWhip.
I'm Larisha, I'm the OpWhip.
Right, thank you. Is Jerome back?
Yeah,
okay.
sorry.
No worries. Okay, thank you very much. All right, first prop whenever you are done. Whenever you're ready. Oh, sorry. I'll be timing, but I won't be able to share screen. So just recommending everyone else to also time themselves, but also time your teammates just in case you guys need to check your times. Thank you.
Okay. Madam Speaker, teaching is the kingpin by which, or the measure of all students gain knowledge under normative means. It is especially important to the individuals under the schooling system who cannot afford certain privileges that other students can, like tuition, like being able to have parents who cater to you in that sense, who help learn independently. We say, let's make teaching meritocratic, let's incentivize teachers to teach better. This debate, our burden is largely about proving two things. One, that the improvement of education can be better improved under our model, which could lead to the improvement of student lives, and that two, under our model, teachers can improve the methods by which they teach. First thing about setup. How are we going to assess the methods in which we pay or grade these teachers? First thing, we would like to claim that it is a relative basing of grades. So we're going to afford by a few metrics. The first thing is we're going to use internal and external examinations. So things like state schooling examinations or like nationwide examinations in which you test students on a bell curve. But also, we would like to factor in things like holistic factors. So in addition to those things, we will factor in things like improvement and the quality of life that the student has to live outside of the school. So making sure things like, how much sports that the student does, how much time do they actually spend in the classroom, whether they have a volatile home life, and whether they have like a history of mental illness, whether their second language, whether all of these different things will be compounded and factored into. We will also have a census to interview each student and each teacher and evaluate on a scale how much effort we believe the teacher has been put in, how much effort has been put in by the teacher and the student on both fronts. We think it's relatively easy to do this through the aid of things like third-party actors such as counselors and stuff like that. Nuances, all of these things will be evaluated relatively, meaning if you come from an impoverished background and maybe you don't get an A, but you go from a D to a C or a D to a B, we still credit those things to the teacher and we won't cut the pay down just because of a binary standard. It is not a strict evaluation. This pay cut, we believe, can be higher than the market average or lower than the market average, depending on how many people report. We will take every complaint seriously. Even if there's just one student that has a problem with the teacher, we will highly evaluate and that complaint and confront it with the teacher. This debate is not so much about the policy. We think it's a value judgment on if it can be done accurately, should it be done. There will never be a perfect system, but we believe our side affords a benefit in the now and a fix to the current issue. 2 points for you today. how does our mechanism incentivize better teaching? And 2, the abdication of the Baroque system under status quo. 3 layers under how our mechanism advises better teaching. First thing, it changes the incentive structures of teachers. In this status quo, we have to recognize there are 2 groups of teachers in this debate. Number 1, the group of good and effective teachers who maybe can elevate and are very easily altruistic and have a lot of hard work, who in both worlds will continue to both improve their own social standing through elevating to higher pay schools, but also will continue to uplift students on either side of the house. But this debate is going to largely take place with the second group of the teachers, which may not be blessed with the same levels of higher education or hard work, or may not and may have grown negligent due to years of either A, maybe you just don't really care about your job, or B, you don't have the motivation to pick up the students who are left behind in the teaching world. We would like to question the opposition by saying we think it's very possible for you to improve your teaching methods. It's not that like bad teaching comes from an inability to be intelligent. Bad teaching comes from an inability to put in your effort. So it looks like things like not properly paying attention to the kind of PowerPoint slides. Maybe you're teaching too fast, or you're not accurately grasping a census of every student and their particular needs. Maybe you need to focus on the fundamentals with specific students and tailor that teaching towards every student. We think that schools have an active responsibility and already recognize the right that teachers should do this. We think this is a way of incentivizing that method. We think it's just looking like things like maybe you take a seminar for like a month, or you go to a workshop automatically because you want that higher pay. We think with the pay structure that we add, the threat that your money might be taken away, obviously we won't go anything other minimum wage, but obviously there will be a pay cut when it comes to the bottom line. This means that you are threatened and you are more likely to invest that amount of effort, invest that amount of time. Notice that the structure we provide of evaluating teachers on improvement and effort means that there is a mitigating factor. That means if you show effort and improvement, we will not take away your pay sensitivity like that. Second layer, the students have a new powerful voice under this system. So the census is something that's very important that we think is coming from our side. Not all schools have a bias, but when they do, we think this applies to them. So certain students in class may face a bias due to factors that were completely out of their control. So things like maybe just not being able to like accurately communicate with your peers, not being able to be a very popular student or communicate with your teachers. We think that the ability for the student to advocate based on how much they believe they've learned, and for counselors to like note whether they are doing this truthfully, it's not that difficult, because of the fact that like it's very easy to tell if a student just flat out doesn't want to learn and like slacks off every day. We think those things are heavily accounted for. In those instances, we still believe that the teacher should advocate a different kind of teaching method to the student. Maybe it looks like things like protesting it in a more enjoyable light, giving the student a better ability to learn. We think that because of that, even things that don't require a teaching ability, like the fact that maybe the student just doesn't have an interest, or maybe the student is just not that good at learning, we think the teacher has an active incentive to intervene in those instances because of that. Third level, the reworking of privilege in society through our mechanism. There is a large disparity of student negligence, of individuals who cannot receive adequate amount of tuition or adequate amount of home education. These people are demotivated, and because of that, from a young age, they felt they cannot perform at school. We change that incentive through by the fact that when teachers are incentivized, they can provide a lot of things to motivate these students, because it now relies on their pay as well. So maybe you can give this student, let's say like, more interesting lessons. You can give them improvement through small term goals. You can tell the student, maybe it's not that important you get the A now. Maybe if you get the C next time, that's important. Second point, about the application of the Baroque system. Why is it that we believe alternatives don't work? So the first thing is, the government has no long-term capital to improve the education system. The fact of the matter is, governments like to elect based on things that they can see and they can prove to their voter base. Improvement in the education system is something that could take 10, maybe 15 years to re-educate all your teachers. We think that's something they have to advocate for. Under our model, we think we pick up the slack just by doing that. You use and optimize the resources that you already have and channel it into the systems. But number two, the check and balance of reputation in these schools is not that functional. If you are around the same group for 10 years, your peers and your co-workers, I doubt that they will check and balance you and risk their friendship to call you out on your ineffective teaching methods. Second layer, the influx of higher levels of passion within the education system. I think because of the now competitive nature of the system, you get individuals who go into teaching because they actually want to teach. This affects people on a long-term level, right? Being able to channel more effort and make like teaching degrees more competitive gives a beneficial effect to students, which goes on to their career, their ability to provide to their family, their ability to self-actualize. But the final thing is an appreciation of morality that you gain from these teachers. So not only can you gain like knowledge from school, but you gain the ability to appreciate certain habits from teachers that you see. So maybe I don't need to be like the most intelligent person, but I can learn the value of being hardworking because my teacher puts in the time to give me PowerPoint slides every day. Maybe I can learn the value of caring about others because my teacher cares about people who don't do that well in class. We think all of these things are very possible, and we do have check and balances like having a board or committee, like having third-party actors intervene, like having census coming from both sides, including parents, teachers, students and teachers. We think we push the burden on opposition. If it is so that teachers can improve, and if it is so that under this system we can have students learn better, why shall we not propose? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now welcome first up here.
Panel, the fundamental problem with the PM's speech was the inclusion of arbitrariness that their metric of teaching performance brings to the education system, right? What do I mean by this, right? First of all, I'd like to talk about salary and how we fundamentally believe that inclusion of arbitrary metrics such as like grade performance, changes of performance are completely not usually in the hand of teachers, because in a large majority of the time there's always a group of students that are so disengaged, a group of students that are just fundamentally unable to learn, students that are fundamentally unable to engage with the learning material, that the teachers fundamentally can do nothing, right? What happened, like we believe that the thing that they want is the creation of incentives, right? But we find that incentives don't need to come with just a reduction in wage, right? We believe that as long as teachers have been putting effort, it's completely justified to give teachers the same amount of money with no pay reductions, right? We find that it's much better to further cement like complaint systems, further create like workshops to better train teachers, rather than forcing this idea of reducing wage for these arbitrary factors that may not necessarily be on their control, right? Panel, understand that it's very hard to reach to these individuals, these very disengaged individuals, and that it's very difficult to even bump their grades up because they're already so disengaged, they've already made up their minds. And second of all, another emphasis that their system, is academic achievement, right? Certainly, they also have other metrics like complaints, but there's also an overwhelming importance of academic achievements in the form of like just performance or just increase in performance, right? We believe that this creates an increased pressure. This requires teachers to create an increased pressure for academic performance. This leads students to believe that there's a heightened importance to their grades, right? But we believe that not everyone has to be sufficient under these academic metrics, right? We believe that the impact of this policy is that students are going to look at themselves in regards to their academics and actually are going to undervalue themselves, not recognizing their natural talents, and they're actively going to be worse off, right? Panel, we fundamentally stand against the inclusion of such arbitrary factors into something that is as critical as the education system, right? We also believe that inclusion of complaints from students is also to an extent arbitrary, right? Students are not necessarily the best judge of everything, and teaching matters are subjective in a lot of cases, right? We believe that students are very easy to catch on to grudges and complain on the basis of whims, particularly teenagers, and we believe that it's not important to allocate too much importance to these complaints per se, right? Second of all, we also believe that there's more to teachers than just teaching, right? These students spend upwards of like 5, 6, 8 hours with teachers almost every day. right? These teachers are very influential. These teachers serve to be role models for these students, right? And in regards to this, I have two things to say, right? First of all, the system does not really account for this tier of importance, right? If we are really to reward teachers, if we are really to reward teachers for everything they're doing for their students, it's absurd to include all the arbitrary factors I've stated above and fail to properly recognize and incorporate this factor, this role model influence factor into this pay grade, right? And second of all, we believe that there's something to say about how this propagates inequality, right? In disparaged communities, in communities of minorities, right? Teachers are very important, right? They're very big role models. Social circumstances, poor social circumstances, and poor familiar circumstances may like really tend to set you off pretty back, right? When you look at your teachers, they appear to be knowledgeable individuals you look up to in spite of all the chaos around you, right? It's very important for these students to have someone to look up to have good teachers to look up to, right? But we believe that the promotion of such a policy will lead to a shortage of teachers, right? Why, panel? Two simple reasons, right? First of all, like most teachers would rather go off to more like affluent, would rather go off to schools that cater to more affluent students that have better connection to resources that will tend to allow them to succeed more often, simply because this is directly related to their pay grade. Their performance is directly related to their pay grade. If they simply go to schools where performance is likely to already be in an incline, their salary is also going to increase, and most teachers are going to want that, and most teachers are going to go towards that direction, right? Second of all, of course, there'll be some tier of teachers. So, yes.
Okay, so teachers that can elevate their salaries by moving schools will do so under either side of the house. But given the fact that some people can't elevate their salaries by moving their job, don't you believe that those individuals have the capacity to increase their effort and teach better?
We believe that it does not all have to be related to wages, right? And in regards to the point that it exists on both sides of the house, we believe that that's not true. When you're actively cutting wages because of the basis of teaching performance, this is furthermore aggravated on your side of the house, right? Because there's more of an incentive for teachers to leave as you lower their wages, right? And I believe that that sort of like disparity on our two sides of the house clearly justifies the idea of why teachers would rather stay in these disparate communities, continue to be role models, right? On that point too, I'd like to talk about the like thing I was talking about. Like there's always going to be a tier of teachers that out of the goodwill of their art will try to sustain themselves, try to do this sort of pro bono work and indulge in these environments of low financial security, right? These are the best of the best teachers we're talking about, but the problem that comes is that their job is not financially secure at all. Eventually, after one point, after like the grades drop by so far because not of their efforts, because of just the inequalities that persist in societies that bring back these students, these teachers are going to have to move jobs, right? Panel, this is very important consideration. No teacher is effectively going to be able to stay in these schools in the long term. What happens? We already see in this in the status quo that inequality in income, inequality in like structural racism has already diverged and introduced discrimination in our system of education. But on their side of the house, this situation is further aggravated as we increasingly run out of teachers that are able to sustain these individuals that require a role model to actively that require a role model in order to allow them to still stay in society. Yes.
Individuals in school, if you can see that there are certain teachers that can uphold and sustain levels of teaching that benefit all the students to get an A, why can't teachers that don't do that currently achieve that standard as well?
Well, I mean, what I'm trying to say is that standard is, first of all, very difficult to achieve, right? Precisely due to the fact that there are difficult individuals because inequalities persist. And like lastly of all, everyone's like preference of teaching style, everyone's way of learning is different, right? It's very absurd to assume that teachers are able to cater to all types of students, all types of individuals with the limited time with the limited 1 hour time they're given with them, right? It's very absurd for you to enforce such arbitrary factors into the wage, right? We believe, and with that, I'd like to end my speech very proud to close.
I thank the first opposition speaker. I now welcome second proposition. Here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Madam Chair, side of opposition never once wanted to contend with the reality of this debate. A debate in which we currently see public education failing in countries like the United States and even in vernacular schools like Malaysia. An education system that does not receive the sort of funding, that does not receive the sort of treatment of teachers that we think merits what they actually do for society. We said, and Jerome already told you, that teachers were the kingpin and determination for the vast majority of students in the country. We are the only ones to want to change that in this debate. I'll prove that to you systemically in my speech today. The first thing I'll do is into rebuttals. So they wanted to firstly say is that people will now leave the good performance schools because obviously in a lower income or impoverished setting, they would not ascertain as good grades. This is a clear misunderstanding of our model, Madam Chair. Understand that we are not going to pay a teacher who teaches a class of A students more than a teacher who teaches a class of C students, because by virtue of this motion, this is about teacher salaries being in relation to their teaching performance. A teaching performance is not determined by what grade someone gets, but by the relative performance of that student and the sort of impact that teacher is able to make. So we say that if a teacher sees someone drop from an A to a B as compared to one from an impoverished background that gets one from a D to a C, obviously the one that has more of an impact and can better help that student will be the one that we pay more, right? So it's about relative performance. They need to contend with that side, with that argument, right? But then they said, many of these factors are out of these teachers' controls, right? So firstly, a reclarification, obviously the relative metric still applies. So we recognize that if someone is born into poverty and has to spend maybe 6 hours a day helping their mother go to the market to sell something, we recognize their performance won't be as good, and this is something that's harder to change. But we can still evaluate the impact that the teacher has through other considerations, such as how much time are they spending with them to talk about these grievances? How much, nurturing time to talk about certain issues do they have? We decided with a holistic metric. But secondly, we contest that premise because understand that teachers, and this applies to all teachers here, so including the ones that teach you literally in kindergarten whatsoever, these people determine literally how you live the rest of your life. They spend 6 hours with you every day. They impart the sort of knowledge that will persist with you throughout your life. We think that's why teachers are almost akin to your parents, which is why when your parents are not in school, teachers make the call on whether to call an ambulance, what sort of treatment they need to give, or resuscitate you if you have a heart attack whatsoever. We akin that those two relationships. They said we can use workshops, but I do not think this is sufficient of a problem as I'll characterize later on, because it does not take into consideration the inherent incentives of teachers, which is the sole determinant for how the education system works, right? The last thing they said is, academic pressure increases. We already told you that's not part of our metric. Sorry, that's not the only part of our metric. So just a clear re-evaluation, a re-clarification of what our metric is. So we think teacher salaries should be proportional to their teaching performance. A teaching performance that is determined A, by grades and test scores and the data of work performance, but secondly, holistic factors such as how much extracurriculars or mental welfare these students have in context of how the teachers teach them. So for example, if this physics teacher nurtures the interest of their student by telling them to go for a science bowl, we think that was the impact and a good teaching performance that they were able to ascertain. We also told you that we can do things like conducting surveys and talking to each student to make sure that no child is left behind. But more importantly, right, just understand that all of this is relatively going to be assessed, and it's not a strict binary by which we determine everyone with a clean slate, right? But more than that, we think ultimately this is about a value judgment and what we ought to do in the status quo. We think this will apply to all schools, all age groups whatsoever. Two things then I'll talk about in my speech. First, extending on what Jerome told you about how we reform the incentive structures of teachers to prioritize the welfare of students. I think what this debate critically needs is a clear illustration of what status quo looks like. A, there is little differentiation and recognition of teacher performances in the vast majority of schools and public schools in many countries. That's to say that two teachers who may be radically different in the means through which they teach and how effective are still paid the same, because there's little regard for the ways in which they teach. There's a little incentive for a school which receives a little funding to want to care about these sorts of intricacies and how they want to pay their salaries whatsoever. We think this stems from the systemic failure of the state, right? Jerome told you about how there's no priority currently for for governments to want to channel more resources and thereby be able to get better teachers into their system, we think that therefore we are able to use the free market and a meritocratic way in which we are able to get teachers. So what does a world in which status quo looks like result in? We think it looks like neglect in many circumstances. That because teachers have no incentive to want to improve, because they do not see any pay rise or any pay cuts as a result, they often neglect their students and they do not want to, spend as much time or effort into the teaching, right? But secondly, it's also a general lack of motivation. And we think this lack of motivation is especially important for those students who might have learning disabilities or may struggle more in class, because the teacher has no regard or no incentive to have to try and change these forms of behaviors. I think that's a world in which they result in a stagnant form of education system that does not improve the quality of life on the ground. But how does this change under our side of the house, right? Because we think by tapping into this idea of teacher salaries, it literally targets at their self-preservation and their ability to get financial independence. That means that even if they might not necessarily be altruistic, the actions that they carry out will necessarily have to be to teach better, to have a better teacher performance index in order to get more pay. We think that changes at a point because in status quo, teaching is not seen as something that is desirable. It's seen as something that's laborious and one that does not credit them for their effort. How exactly do we think this is going to manifest in the teaching? We think there's going to be a greater effort to go through class material and teach because there's an incentive for them to get higher pay. We think it also means that they will spend more time with students to ensure that their mental and psychological welfare is good. We think it's spending more time in general. But secondly, how we systematically improve the education system and derive long-term benefits for society. So understand that in the status quo, look at Malaysia, look at the United States, look at the UK, the perception of teaching in the status quo is one in which it is laborious, non-rewarding, and I only work in a 9-to-3 job before I go on, take a break on the weekend, right? I think we can see this through like the teachers that go on the Ellen show and voice their grievances about the public education system and how they do not get enough pay even though they work very hard. Now this changes under our side of the house where where people have an inherent incentive to want to improve because they realize that their merits will be credited and they will finally be regarded for what sort of impact they're making to these student communities. But more than that, right? We think it's where teaching is currently seen as like a second choice job. So I want to become an astronaut, but if I'm unable to get that, I'll just become a teacher. That changes on the outside of the house, where now teaching is seen as an honorable job that more people, more qualified and capable individuals can opt into, right? We think this has several long-term benefits. We see that the reason why many students who turn to violence or crime in many like schools see like the US education system is because of the failure of teachers to want to intervene, in bullying cases. It's the failure of teachers to want to actually impart their wisdom to these teachers. That changes on the outside of the house. But secondly, where teaching is the kingpin of economic success and productivity in society, I think you inspire more passion for subjects like mathematics or physics whatsoever. It might also be like language proficiency, where currently SJKCs in Malaysia fail that. That changes under our side of the house and only under our side of the house in which we adopt a meritocratic system to allow teachers to finally deserve the honor they get and impart the sort of knowledge that we think benefits all of society. Very proud to propose.
Thank you very much, second prop. I now welcome second op. You're here.
Yeah, I'm audible, right? I can be heard?
I can hear you, but there's a bit of an echo. So, yeah.
Is this better? Any better?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Respected speaker, the proposition comes up and tells you that the education system is failing. We need change in today's day. Let me start from that very point. Let me tell you why connecting the incompetence of teachers, the supposed incompetence of teachers, and the failure of the education system itself is wrong. We tell you that the education system in today's day is failing because of a lack of facilities in school. because of shorter memory spans, because of shorter attention spans of students due to increased screen times. Right? We tell you that there is a complacency in students, in the youth in today's day in regards to learning, because the internet actively promotes a notion of drop out of school and become a tech billionaire, and kids actively fall for that notion. That piece by the education system is largely failing in today's day. It is not because of teachers' incompetence as a whole. Right? They tell you that their metric is holistic. Right? They tell you that that we're going to look into a lot of things, right? But then the thing is that you cannot come up and say that we will increase a math teacher's salary because students who have like several other ECS, for example, they're on the football team and are still able to maintain their math grade, right? You cannot say that, because shouldn't the increase in salary be for the football coach who has actually made the kid a good football player? So the metric of like a holistic approach is rather ambiguous to me, right? And with that point, I'd like to, it actually boils down to grades at the end of the day, right? Be it relative. Which is something that I'll counter later in my speech. They talk to you about how they're going to interview students, how students are now likely to have a powerful voice in correcting their teachers or something of that sort. We tell you that this is harmful. We tell you that the over-inclusion of students in such a process is extremely harmful, because kids are inherently irrational. For example, if a teacher shouts at a student for misbehaving, the student is not going to look at all the good that the teacher has done for him, but rather over prioritize the one time that the teacher shouted at him in front of the entire class and embarrassed him, and that is going to boil down into the kid having a bad perception of the teacher, and then in the interview telling that, well, the teacher is bad. So we can tell you that this metric in itself is not perfect, is not as good as the proposition does, right? Then they talk to you about how only through this policy can teachers and the education system in itself become better. Well, we tell you that none of the things that they suggest are different or exclusive from the status quo in any way whatsoever. Right? Schools actively host workshops or similar programs that try to make education as perfect as possible, that try to make teachers' ways as good as possible. Right? Schools actively involve students and parents about teaching performance and subsequently suggest these teachers to make amendments to their ways without penalizing them monetarily. Right? Teachers have an incentive in today's date because they are actively scrutinized and they lack a strong hold on the job. Right? Because as soon as because with enough complaints, it's very likely that they'll lose their job. They'll be out of that job. So we tell you that they do have an incentive today's days. It does not have to be through a monetary penalty. Right? Let me go into reiterating. No, thank you, sir. Let me go into reiterating and telling you what we have to say in terms of their metric, that it should be about relative performance and about exams. Right? We tell you that the performance of a student does not directly align with the effort put in by a teacher and the performance of the said teacher. There's several layers to this. No, thank you, sir. For example, a student's learning style might not align with the way a teacher teaches, for example. Right? For example, if a teacher has a book-based teaching method, I as a student respond to more interactive forms of teaching, then and do not respond to his way of teaching, does not mean the teacher is not a good teacher or he's failing at his job. Right? Second, interests of a student. That is something that needs to be considered. That there are several students who might be taking science classes in high school because they are required to, but they don't plan on majoring in physics in college, and hence they think that it is not as important for them to do well in it, and they have a mindset that it's okay if I just let this subject be, right? And in such a case where a student has such a strong mindset, you cannot simply say that they'll become better, or like just teachers somehow putting more effort is likely to make this individual think that, okay, I do actually have to put in a lot of effort into physics in today's day, even though I'm not going to major in it in the future. Next, let's talk about background of students. Right? This is extremely important in this debate. Certain individuals come from troubled homes, faltering families, just generally a state where they are unable to prioritize education and focus on it at the end. As the end all. They simply can't bump up. No, thank you, sir. They simply can't bump up their grade from a D to a C. Because the prop tells you so easily that it is about relative grades, it's about improvement. But we tell you that they simply cannot do this. They simply cannot bump their salary from 1100 to a 1200, or the grade from a D to a C, right? From a D to a C, right? And next point I'd like to talk about is exams as a whole, or standardized testing as a whole. No, thank you, sir. We tell you that these metrics in themselves are faulty. Right? They tell you that we're going to include internal and external exams. We tell you that these themselves are faulty. Why is that so? First of all, as I already told you at the beginning, teaching performance is likely to be judged from student performance in such exams, as they have told you on their side as well. But the problems with this are mainly two. Number one, we already tell you that some individuals cannot prioritize studies at home and cannot do that 1600 SCAT score or even that 1150 SCAT score, right? As students who can spend hours practicing at home or buying themselves spots into private tuition. That simply, they have not given us enough analysis to say that as teachers can simply help a student that drastically. But the second reason, no, thank you, sir. But the second reason, some students simply do not respond well to such sort of testing, meaning that some individuals might have pre-exam anxiety because they're likely to be focused during the exam, likely to not perform as well in the exam. Right? So the exam can be a metric of saying whether this teacher has done a good job or not. But secondly, certain students also have trouble simply sitting on a desk for 3 hours and answering questions non-stop. Right? We tell you that exam in itself cannot be such a big metric. And especially when I tell you that the holistic method is extremely ambiguous and largely this policy is going to be based on grades, we tell you this is extremely important. Let's talk about pragmatics. No, thank you, sir. I have a lot of that. Sorry. All this that I've already told you and my first speaker has told you, it's especially important because we tell you that duties of teachers goes beyond just ensuring that every student gets that perfect GPA or every student just makes a relative increase in their grade, right? Even from that D to a C, that E to a D, right? Teachers serve models for several students. Individuals who they can look up to, individuals who they can share their daily struggles with. This is especially true in poorer regions of countries where teachers actively seek to inspire and aid them in living through the difficulties, living through the conditions. Right? The harm of making salary proportional to arbitrary notions of teaching performance is that teachers who are actually making this effort in today's day to actively change children's lives in particularly bad situations are now de-incentivized to continue teaching in those areas because, as I've already told you, these students are simply not able to increase their performance, are simply not able to bump up their grades, right? But also let's talk about how teachers are going to overpressure kids in this situation, right? When a teacher's wage depends on every making an improvement on his grade or maintaining his grade level, which he's simply not able to do because of the reasons that both of us talked about, my first speaker and I have talked about. What happens then is that this teacher becomes overpressurizing in nature, right? He assigns way too many assignments in the hope that this individual, that the student is actually going to somehow increase his grade, or he's going to give several tests so that the student will somehow be able to increase his grade. But we tell you that this is simply not possible, right? We tell you that this affects their mental health and this affects what education is actually about. This policy makes education extremely grade focused, which is inherently wrong. You do not need to have any relative improvement in your grades for you to yield the best out of school, right? No, sir, the time is almost last. All right, we tell you that education is more than just increasing your grades, is more than just grades. It's more than just, it's more than maintaining or bumping up your grades. We tell you that only our side prioritizes that, but on the other side, they make education all about grades, right? With that, I'd like to end my speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now welcome Third Pop. Here.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
We wholeheartedly agree with what the side of opposition is telling us when they say that education is not merely grades, it is not merely just teaching a subject and leaving the very next day. The question that then begs is, why is it wrong to reward exceptional teachers that take the time and effort to cultivate a sense of love in education, that spend the extra hours to answer these students' questions outside of the school, outside of the working time within school? And why is it wrong that we incentivize complicit and careless teachers that have no regard for the ability for the student to learn in a conducive environment when their future depends on it? We think that education is something that has to be safeguarded. It's an important pillar in order for students to succeed. It determines the very future, the very lives they're going to live. Teachers have to be held to this standard. We need to have the best possible teachers. We think on the side of proposition, by having teacher salaries be proportional to their teaching performance, we create that incentive. I'll tell you in my rebuttal several reasons why what the mitigatory and the counter setups that they wanted to provide to you on the side of opposition is insufficient. Then I'll move on to my clashes and issues. Number one, they told us it's unnecessary to create the incentive structure that we wanted because they have things like workshops or training programs. The giant difference between these two things and the reason why it only can be effective on our side is that workshops and training programs are intrinsic and self-dependent on whether or not the teacher wants to apply the training methods that they are taught there, whether they want to actually take an effort to attend these workshops in the very first place, to pay attention. There's zero incentive for them to want to do so. The only incentive provided on the side of opposition is literally getting fired. This means that all a teacher has to do in order to secure the financial stability is barely teach the bare minimum. As long as my entire class does not get an F, and I can secure my job, that is the only metric in which I need in order to secure my job. This debate is not about the exceptional teachers that are already present in both worlds. It is about changing the teachers that are complicit and do not care as much about the livelihoods of individuals on the ground. Secondly, they told us about the census system that we have and why it is ineffective because students are irrational. We don't think we're going to take one complaint from one student that the teacher scolded and destroy this individual's salary as a result? Are they actually trying to tell you that in a class of 30 to 20 students, every single student will hate you and it's for unjustified reasons? We think if an entire class believes you're an incompetent teacher, that they are unable to learn, there has to be some legitimate reason as to why this is so. We think even if there's one complaint about a teacher, we will take it up, but this does not mean we will take action and immediately reduce the teacher's salary based on one complaint. We think there needs to be a collectivization or a compounding of these kinds of complaints to actively take action. And lastly, before I move on to my issues, side of opposition only wanted to argue in the most convenient of circumstances. Individuals with the worst possible home lives that suffer domestic abuse. Individuals apparently fundamentally unable to learn, and how the solution to this in our world is suddenly that teachers will over-assign homework simply to improve them, and that will cause pressure on students. This is the very problem inside of opposition's world that they needed to defend. The way in which teachers work, they are unadaptive to the student environment that they're in. They think that assigning homework will magically improve them, and that is it. The difference on our side, if that is the case with the teachers they wanted to tell us, now there's a change incentive. If over-assigning homework does not do anything for my students, and my teacher performing game is horrible, my students are unsatisfied in the environment, they are unhappy when they learn, and on top of that, their exam grades are failing to produce results as a result of my methods, we provide the change incentive that side of opposition does not want to provide. They produced you a problem, we gave you the solution. They never wanted to tell you how they solve the problems that are prevalent in both sides of the very house. Now, moving on to my issues in both sides of the debate. We think, number one, on the arbitrariness that they wanted to impose on us. We don't think the proficiency of a teacher, the very job that they have to ensure a student does well in school educationally and holistically, is something that's arbitrary. We think, like, similarly, a police officer's job to ensure the rates of crime are low is not an arbitrary metric we set on them. This is the responsibility and a job that they consented to and accepted in the very first place. We don't think punishing you for being an incompetent teacher, for not producing results, for actively ruining the lives of these individuals is unjustified for us to take this proportionality. The difference is we provide an opt-out mechanism because simply if you do not want to be paid less, all you have to do is become a better teacher. If the problem in their world was that some students are unable to learn because they're hands-on, this means teachers have to adapt in the class. This means they have to have more PowerPoint presentations, more colors in their presentations, taking them out to the library instead of just staying in the class the entire day. These are steps a teacher in our world on the side of proposition would take, that side of opposition would never take in the very first place. We don't think arbitrariness is something that's completely true. We think maybe at least happiness is arbitrary, but we think it's still measurable in this context. Because if a student is miserable compared to a student that is happy, we don't have to measure how happy they are, but by virtue of just them being in a better environment and them feeling comfortable, that is sufficient enough to prove that this arbitrary thing is considerably measurable in their side. Now we want to take into account the context they wanted to engage with. The disengaged, apparently fundamentally unable to learn individuals on our side. We think, number one, we contest the premise that there are individuals that are fundamentally unable to learn. We think that the very reasons they told us about individuals with hard home lives that are unable to learn in their environment is because the teacher does not take an active effort to want to improve the student's life. And we think this exists on a scale. Because notice in their side, if they have one backsliding student, but they have 20 other students that are performing perfectly fine, they have no incentive to change this. On our side, the ability for you to improve that student's academic records or their livelihood in class could lead to an increase in your salary. It could lead to you better able to have financial stability. We don't think what they told you on how all teachers will magically leave and have no jobs is something that is correct, or this is not the world that it will look like. Because if it's so simple to just move to higher performing schools, that is the end goal of all teachers in both worlds. But we don't think teachers can simply just opt out in the very first place. This is about teachers that are already within those systems that can improve by not having to move to a better school, that by virtue of being in an impoverished community, I can still earn the same pay as an individual in a city public school. These are the incentives that we create in the very first place. But we also told you and clarified that being in a class full of individuals with A's, with high A's, does not constitute you being a good teacher. We told you that it's a relative basis. We tell you that because we also have these sensors to provide like the work-life balance that a student needs. These are also factors we take into account, even if you teach at the top A class. But even if you teach at the worst possible classes, if your student is able to improve, which we don't think is an impossible feat that they wanted to characterize you in the first place. We think the reason individuals are unable to climb from that D to a C margin is because teachers are unable to make a lesson interesting, unable to invoke a sense of passion within the education system in the very first place. The brokenness of the education system was never the failure of the facilities. If a biology teacher needed to teach about the respiratory structure, they don't need to have a direct 3D scale model. They can have a bottle with a balloon to show the lungs. These are the steps teachers in our work would take. Facilities are arbitrary, or maybe to some degree improve it, but we don't think it is solely we think the teachers are liable for the futures of these individuals. We think you should side with side proposition.
I'm so sorry. Can I use the washroom quickly? Like 1 minute.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can. But just wait for a second.
Sure.
No worries.
Can I start now?
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, wait. Wait, I'll make my brother stop something. Yeah, I'm sorry for that. My little brother was playing some YouTube thing and it was distracting. Yeah. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, what I believe is that side opposition stands on the principle that education exists not just for academic excellence, but also for the existence of opportunity. Now, why do we say that necessarily is that both sides argue that the kind of people we need to cater for are the people who are vulnerable, right? However, what side proposition fails to understand is the existence of teachers in itself, right? We're talking about teachers in the type of status quo they've labeled. That's like probably neighborhoods with lower income, neighborhoods where teachers are needed. It's not a debate that's taking place in a better neighborhood, right? However, now, if that is the metric of the debate, we believe that we win clearly. Why is that so? Side opposition has told you how necessarily these teachers should be paid even if it's not necessary for like their academic excellence, right? Or like their ability to produce A stars, right? It's necessarily exists because they're working in certain places. Why is that important? Is because in certain vulnerable communities, certain people just cannot do the thing, right? They told you about how no, but still people can probably probably work is hard. But however, you need to understand,
Point.
if a student is depressed, a teacher shouldn't necessarily be like told to cure their depression, right? That's not necessarily what a teacher is there for, right? A teacher cannot at certain points make certain people do certain things, right? We believe that because of this, an extremely arbitrary factor would actually de-incentivize certain teachers to just exist. We're not talking about very good teachers. We're talking about the thing that our impact isn't necessary that, oh, all the good teachers should shift to vulnerable places. It's that in vulnerable places, teachers should exist, right? Side proposition tries to tell you how these teachers in vulnerable areas would become best teachers because their incentive now is to earn more money, right? However, let's analyze this, right? We're talking about places where certain individuals from the ground low have never necessarily thought about education as something important, right? They've never necessarily thought about education as the very best. We're not talking about the few people in certain neighborhoods who have perfect scores, who want to study. It's about a lot of people who think that the system has failed them, who don't necessarily care about education, right? Because you need to understand, a student might be perhaps really good at drawing, right? However, the kind of teacher we're talking about right now is probably the physics teacher who can't necessarily make that person get an A star because the person can't study physics at all. What you're talking about is that you're de-incentivizing this physics teacher to actually just exist in a place where he needs to exist, right? Because it's a lot about opportunity.
Point.
It's a lot about the no sir, I won't take your point now. It's a lot about perhaps this teacher just existing, right? Now let's, if the metric to judge is the vulnerable, right, let's look at three stakeholders here, right? So first, let's look at the teachers. We've already told you about how if salary is the incentive, at certain times the teacher can do nothing to change the student's perception. They can do nothing to change gets a B plus, because at certain points the teacher cannot interfere to the teacher can't necessarily make a black person earn money when he's in an impoverished family. He can't necessarily feed that black people. He can't necessarily bring back the dad who left him, right? We believe that at certain instances a teacher can do nothing. The system, however holistic it may be, cannot account for those, right? We tell you about how when such a metric exists, the teacher now will be kind of left with a lesser salary, right? They will be de-incentivized to exist, right? We believe that a teacher, because they cannot do everything, they still need to exist. In our model, teachers would still exist in those vulnerable societies, right? However, no sir, I won't take your POI. Now let's talk about perhaps the students here, right? We've analyzed to you how students would perhaps have a pressure to have academic interests, even though they don't have any academic aspirations, right? We tell you about, if the goal of side proposition is to create a world where people are better accounted for, in essence to their education, they're more accounted for, right? We tell you about how when you're actually pressurizing these students to do something they don't want for, it can result in two things. One, it can result in them complying, however later on deciding that they never wanted this, or they cannot comply and then result in a teacher getting out of the job that the teacher needs to exist in, right? Now, they've also told you about how, oh, complaints won't be like 1% out of 20 is complaining. Well, that's kind of a bizarre thing to say, because you need to understand that population is based on a very random thing, right? If you look at experiments, that's why experiments work when they're based on something as arbitrary, right? Because population is always divided into places where in a class there might be certain people who learn a certain way and certain people who don't, right? My first speaker already told you about how a teacher cannot cater to every single kind of student. However, they still are probably a good teacher. No, sir, I won't take your POI. So we've already established how students face a burden, and in many cases students don't necessarily work as hard, right? Or don't get the academic excellence that side propositions wants those students to get, right? However, I believe the biggest stakeholder in this debate is the education system in itself. What does the education system look like? We tell you about how now teachers would leave schools, right? However, side proposition tries to tell you about how no, people won't leave school because the backout mechanism is them being better teachers. Well, no, if you're earning $5 an hour at a school and you can still earn $5 an hour at McDonald's, don't you think they'll shift to McDonald's? Because those are the kind of teachers who will be left in these vulnerable institutions, right? These vulnerable schools, right? We believe that better teachers, if they do exist, will probably go to better schools. We believe that that's how it works. But we tell you that if you are to cater to perhaps certain individuals who need those teachers, even if these teachers just exist, that would be a better world than a place where only great teachers exist, or so as how they want to portray it, right? Now let's look at what side opposition gave to you in this debate, right? We told you how our impact necessarily is teachers existing. We told you about how it's unfair for teachers to be based on teachers' salaries to be based on something as arbitrary as perhaps student perception, student academic excellence. We told you about how students are never good actors to kind of delve into how a person is paid, because necessarily what you need to understand is that these teachers, these students might have certain prejudices against certain teachers, right? We're talking about students who probably think a maths teacher who teaches only on paper basis is a bad teacher, while other students think that that works for them, right? We already told you how arbitrary that is. And we also tell you about how the education system for certain individuals leads to just. We told you about how teachers can still get better through workshops, which side opposition told you is perhaps, about how the comparative is of incentives, right? No, we believe that the comparative exists as, would you rather get paid a lot more in McDonald's, where you actually need that money for a livelihood, or would you rather just exist for certain students who need opportunities, right? If you're a really good teacher, that's best for both worlds, right? However, what we believe is that we're ready to let go really, really great teachers if it means that more teachers exist to provide opportunity for certain people. We've already established to you why, if a teacher is extremely horrible, if he doesn't treat special needs kids the way they should be, a lot of complaints will result in that teacher being kicked out, replaced by another teacher, right? However, what side proposition gives to you is that in a lot of places, a lot of teachers will be kicked out. There will be a shortage of teachers in a place where funds are already short, right? We believe that what impact actually exists is that in places where everything is fine, teachers are great, nothing changes. However, this debate exists in a place where certain teachers cannot bring out the best academic abilities of certain individuals because there are deeper rooted problems that one teacher cannot solve. In many cases, a teacher will be worse or de-incentivized by something they can't control. A person having better drawing abilities than physics abilities would result in a drawing teacher being paid more just by chance, and another teacher being paid less just by chance. We believe that that is a completely unfair metric to base anything on, and that is why we are proud to propose.
Thank you very much. I now welcome Out Reply. Here.
Just a moment. Panel, side proposition is under the impression that teachers should and can teach everyone, and teachers should teach everyone to their full satisfaction, right? But there's a kind of absurdity and a paradox to that, right? We're talking about a room with one teacher and 30 students, each student having their own opinion, each student having their own unique ideals, their circumstances, and like different opinions on the teaching style. Right? It's very absurd. It's a very absurd burden to put on teachers to be able to like satisfy everyone, right? And that's what side propositions policy fundamentally does, right? It enforces this absurd burden, and even worse of all, it directly connects it to the idea of financial security. And we believe that this is fundamentally wrong. What we instead have advocated for since the start is that given sufficient effort from the teachers, we should give them the same pay, right? We believe that not everything is under the teacher's hand, and our education system should directly like take into account that exact limitation of teaching, right? Panel, another thing they can give us is this whole model of heuristics, and they tell us that our statements about it being very it being a very like arbitrary impositions is absurd, right? But panel, that's not true, right? What's absurd is on their side of the house when a science teacher gets credited for the sports performance of one of his students, right? Something completely not related. They, in doing so, in including these other heuristics, side proposition has realized that academic performance is not a very good sole indicator, right? But the fact of the matter is, academic performances will, at the end of the day, always continue to rule over even under their side of the house, right? Even under their metrics, as most of my speakers have continued to say, right? Teachers are, of course, going to try to put pressure or try to increase like their salary based on things they can control. And what's the thing that they can directly control? They can directly control academics. They can directly put pressure on students, and hence all the harms we tell you about the pressure comes, right? Panel, teachers cannot fundamentally save anything. These circumstances, particularly in disparaged rooms, cannot be saved by all teachers. We need to understand that, and we need to still recognize that even in these areas, these teachers serve a very, very important purpose of being role models, right? Whereas these children are regularly exposed to a world of crime, a world of chaos. These teachers can be influential role models, and the only way for like they don't need to influence their lives just academically, right? And that's a failure on that's a fundamental failure on side opposition, right? We fundamentally believe that on their side of the house, such inequalities further increase, the shortage of teachers further build up, and education fundamentally reaches shambles, right? As discrimination becomes institutionalized in when they create this sort of incentive program, right? We believe that already we've got a very sufficient incentive program that does not require wage alterations, and we believe that complaints and concerns from parents, complaints and concerns from students are regularly listened to and done actionable on, right? Schools actively take action against these teachers, and these teachers are actively promoted to get better, right? We believe that there's no reason to add this we believe that there's no reason for side proposition to bring wage into the question when it brings into harm the livelihoods of so many teachers that are actively putting effort into their work and not seeing their results just because of arbitrary reasons, right? We fundamentally believe that in that sense, side proposition has completely failed to show us the benefits of their model, right? With that, I'd like to end my speech. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. Now to end this, I call upon Governor Bly. Here.
Madam Chair, in an education system where people continue to be jeopardized by the lack of quality teaching, when they continue to be deprived of the sort of knowledge and skills that will enable them to flourish in the future, we think an action needs to be done, one that currently does not exist in the status quo where governments do not have political to make this change. We do not think it's enough for them to stand for some sort of workshop program that already exists in the status quo and is unable to derive the sort of benefits that we illustrated to you in all three speeches on the side of government. We told you that reforming the incentive structures of teachers in and of themselves was going to be the most long-term sustainable and effective change through this. I have two issues I'll talk about in this speech, and I'll prove to you why on both levels they failed their burden. On the first, on the welfare of teachers. So they ran a generic argument in which you now treat teachers unfairly. A, because some students are irrational. B, because students have trouble in exams. And thirdly, because they cannot sit in an exam hall for 3 hours. Madam Chair, note all of these instances are only going to occur in their best case scenario, but more importantly, they're only nitpicking on certain individual instances and not systemically going to evaluate what the consequences of this policy is. We posit to you firstly that many of these are not arbitrary, and the teachings and provisions of a teacher oftentimes influences how these people are going to perform, right? So if they are unable to stare at the screen for 3 hours, we think we incentivize them to use other forms of teaching, maybe not necessarily ones on a computer. But secondly, right, we consider that these arbitrary factors are going to be in the consideration of teaching performances. Madam Chair, it is absurd of them to posit to us that just because a teacher in an impoverished neighborhood has his students getting a D, that he's automatically going to be paid less than someone in a richer school. The reason this is because that's not factored into our metric. We told you from the very beginning that each is going to be relevant to the circumstances of the teaching classroom. So if a student is born into an impoverished household and cannot have the means to succeed, then we consider that in the evaluation of this teaching performance, it was never an absolute or objective metric by which we determine this. But note, right, all they wanted to talk about, this student who was irrational, or this person who couldn't concentrate, were all one irrational student, one bad student. These do not constitute the vast majority unless they really want to argue that no one at all can succeed at physics, that no one at all is going to be rational in these instances. We think this is about a large-scale consideration about the tens of classes that a teacher teaches, right? If they were to say that a population is arbitrary and could not determine, we say they just oppose the entire field of statistics in determining what we ought to do in society. But we told you furthermore that these arguments are all very mitigatory in nature and only challenging the feasibility of our arguments without actually telling us why, in and of itself, it was one that was bad, right? We told you instead that we are able to reform incentive structures through this aspect of self-preservation, where teachers can finally use this incentive for monetary remuneration as the means by which they improve, which doesn't happen under their side of the house. But here's the thing, even if one or two of the teachers are unjustly treated under our side of the house in their very best case scenario, we think that the benefits to society as a whole and the vast majority of students in a country in which teachers finally have the incentive to improve is one that overwhelmingly crowds out that marginal harm. Secondly, on the education system, we told you that understand that it's far, like they said that teachers would leave to good performance schools. Firstly, we think it's far easier to improve themselves than literally choose a different profession. But secondly, they often can't. So teachers in poorer schools often cannot move to Eton just because of geography and other factors like that. But thirdly, we already told you that our metrics consider the economic and social circumstances of the area. But more importantly, we told you overarchingly, we reform and finally honor the merits of the teaching profession. And this not only improves teachers, but makes more teachers opt in because they know that they'll be currently recognized for their merits. Where I continue to see teachers in Malaysia or the status quo in failing public education systems who say, I'm just here to earn money and get out of here. That's something that we want to change, and we think that must come from a radical incentive. We get long benefits such as better economic productivity of society through better students whatsoever. We're very, very proud to propose.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'll call you back when I have the results.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.